Hey, everybody, welcome back to our next chapter in our ongoing exploration through the story as we continue to work our way through the ongoing biblical narrative with the book put together by Randy Frazee. This week, we are looking at chapter 12, which is entitled The Trials of a King. Our focal point this time around, I should say the character that we're focusing in on, is King David within this chapter. It picks up after he has become king, the second king of Israel, following the death of Saul that we heard about towards the tail end of last chapter. And while David was considered very successful as kings, he's probably considered the greatest of Israel's kings, he was not perfect. And his reign featured issues, both self-generated, as we hear about, as well as issues from the outside that he also had to deal with. A very rough timeline. It's kind of really hard to zero in on this one because we don't exactly have specifics. We know David became king around the year 1000 BC-ish. When things pick up, he's already in Jerusalem, and so we know we are at least 7 years into his reign because the narrative does tell us that he reigned for 7 years in Hebron before moving the capital to Jerusalem and being king there. In all likelihood, it's probably a little bit longer than that too. David reigned for about 40 years, and we have little hints that he's probably getting a little older when all of this picks up. The main thing that we get from that is actually right at the beginning. We hear it's spring and the kings go out to war, but this time around, David does not go. It's likely he's getting a little bit older and he's not physically going out to lead warfare like he did in his younger years. We hear about some of his various military commanders who are doing this. And what's funny about that is that he had fit that same role for Saul earlier. We kind of heard some of that last time and know about some of that in the narratives. And this is an echo that we'll hear again because the same sort of thing happens that eventually leads to the kingdom dividing itself, but I'm getting a couple of chapters ahead of myself there. So anyway, we're probably a little ways into David's reign. We don't know exactly how far, but we do know that everyone else has gone out to war. It's springtime, and he is still in Jerusalem. The chapter where we find ourselves within the biblical, the Bible, I should say, this is kind of the tail end of 2 Samuel. I'm having trouble talking today. A few inclusions of various examples of the Psalms. If you're not familiar, David is attributed to having written a lot of the Psalms. Whether he actually did or not is, of course, in question, but because of his ability as a musician and apparently as a poet, he's a real Renaissance man, apparently. That's why a few of the Psalms are also included in this chapter as well. We have three main sections that we can really break this chapter down into. We have David's sin, aka adultery and conspiracy to murder, and the fallout that comes from that. We have his son Absalom's rebellion against David, and then his preparations for building the temple. Those are kind of the three main breakdowns that we have. A few important secondary characters that we hear about that play a part in the story this time, of course, Bathsheba and Uriah at the center of David's sinful issues. Then we have the prophet Nathan, who is the apparent prophetic heir to Samuel after Samuel is dead, and he's been dead for a while. And now we have the prophet Nathan, who calls David out at one point. And then we have Solomon, who is David's eventual favored son and heir. He's the second child with Bathsheba. If you recall from reading it, the first one dies. And he's also the focus of next chapter. So Solomon will become increasingly important beyond what we hear from him here towards the tail end of this chapter. I'm not really going to go over the specifics of the story too much, but a few important points that I think are worth mentioning, some themes that emerge or some ideas that kind of came into my head as I was thinking about this. This chapter serves as a reminder, especially this first section, that God uses imperfect people over and over and over again. And this is an ongoing theme that we hear repeated a lot. David joins a very long list that includes Moses, who was a murderer, Noah, who was a drunkard at various times. Each of the patriarchs had their issues. We'll have more and more and more examples of people who also have issues that we've already had and that we'll have moving into the future. So God uses imperfect people, which includes pretty much all of us. So that's an important thing for us to remember. It's also important for us to remember that no one is immune from sin, no matter how faithful we might be. David is described as a man after God's own heart, a great lover of God. God loved David, and yet David was a sinful person too. So that's a good reminder for us. He also does, though, embody the importance of honesty and repentance. Once he gets caught, once things are out on the table, he owns it and he repents of it. And that is a good example for us. Not that his example of sinfulness is great, but his example of how to then move on from it is. And then finally, I think that this chapter serves as some big examples of the way that sin affects not just the individual. It's not just David that we're talking about here. Uriah dies. Bathsheba has some pretty bad times too. A little bit more about her in a bit. The baby dies. The first baby dies. So we remember that sin harms not only us as individuals, but it harms others and it damages relationship in so many ways. So those are kind of some of those themes that I want to bring up that really stem from this first section dealing with David's sinfulness. Moving on from there, let's think a little bit about the rebellion of Absalom. I can't help but think that it's a little bit of an echo. You know, I love my echoes, but it's a little bit of an echo even about David's situation with Saul. Different, of course, but there are some common themes. Absalom was, I can't read my own writing there. No, I can't. Sorry. Absalom was a little more intentional about his rebellion than David was. David tried to serve Saul and tried to protect Saul at various times. Absalom was flat out rebelling against his father. So a little bit different there. It is likely due, we don't know what his motivation is, but we can maybe assume that Absalom's motivation was because David was already beginning to favor Solomon. Solomon had been born at this point, although he was still quite young when the rebellion happened. And Absalom wanted power for himself. And if dad is going to pass on power to Solomon, well, then I better take power before Solomon's too old to get it. And so we can assume that that's probably his motivation. But he works his way towards it very intentionally. Regardless. And a bigger play here, Absalom's rebellion is just one example of some pretty messy family dynamics. David had a large family, several wives, a lot of kids, a lot of power struggles that went on, and there were a lot of issues in here. Now, a lot of them seem to stem from Absalom, although not just him. But Absalom was also involved in killing his own half-brother named Amnon, which was the result of Amnon raping his half-sister Tamar, and Tamar is the full sister of Absalom. So Absalom was avenging his sister against his half-brother, and that's a whole different thing that we don't get into here in the story, but it's in the narrative, so that's all going on there. And these are just a couple of examples of some really, really messy family dynamics that we see within David's family. Moving on from here, plans for the temple. David wants to honor God with a house, moving on from the tabernacle or just the unpermanent, is that a word? The non-permanent location of where the ark is stored and where God dwells, remains, whatever we want to say that. But moving on from the tabernacle. Now, God is pleased with this, but says, David, you're not going to be the one to do it. You've been at war too long. You've caused too much death and destruction. David's reign, side note, was bloody. And it was expansion and control through violence, which I can't help but think sounds like a lot of growth of empires. More on that here in a second as well. So God taps Solomon. Your son will be the one to build it. And David's like, well, that's cool, but we're going to make this as easy as possible. We're going to do a lot of the preparation work for him. David makes prep for Solomon to have success. And it works, but not perfectly. What's interesting about that whole situation, and this is some foreshadowing, but when Solomon actually gets to work, it takes him a long time to build the temple. And by all accounts, the temple is amazing. Solomon spends 7 years building the temple. But When that's done, Solomon then spends almost twice as long building his own palace, which is almost 4 times larger, which raises the question, Solomon, what were you focusing on? But again, that's foreshadowing. I'm getting ahead of myself. Those are kind of the 3 main sections. So I'm going to let you guys talk about them. But before we wrap it up, of course, I'm going to talk about the problematic stuff and a little bit of foreshadowing again. The biggest issue that I have, big, like big bold letters issue that I have, is the way that Bathsheba is treated. She has no agency in this situation whatsoever, which is revealing of the culture at the time. And I'm not saying that's okay. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying it's not okay. But she's got no agency. And I can't help but think there's a little bit of an echo with Bathsheba and David if we think clear back to Hagar and Abraham and Sarah, too, in that whole situation. Her husband is killed. She's pretty much raped when David first brings her into the palace the first time. And she loses her child. Her child dies. And above all that, the focus is not on her. She's completely secondary in this. We hardly hear her say anything whatsoever. And even though David apparently eventually loves her and marries her and brings her into the palace post this whole Uriah situation, it does not really focus well on the way that he treats her. So that is very, very problematic to me there. This also reveals David's attitude that he can do whatever he wants. Perhaps you've heard the idea power corrupts. And this is something that Samuel had warned the people about, generation and a half or 2 generations prior. And we see that happen. David just thinks that he can do whatever he wants. He can have his way. And then when things go haywire, he can just cover it up. And eventually he gets called out on that. So that's something to keep in mind of his attitude is problematic. And the last thing, and this is a bit of the foreshadowing, I'm going to kind of close with this. So Israel is in the process of becoming the new empire. It started under Saul. It continued and greatly expanded under David. It would continue under Solomon, or will continue under Solomon. But in a lot of ways, Israel is becoming the new Egypt. And for generations, God had warned the people of Israel, don't do that. Remember what you came from and where you came from and the way that you were oppressed. Don't do that to others. And yet that's exactly what we see beginning to happen. It's really going to peak under Solomon, but it's well underway at this point. So that's everything I have. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thanks, everybody.